To succeed in a light-speed world, leaders need to spread the power of systems thinking throughout the organization. It's not sufficient if just a few people understand the principles behind systems thinking. Everyone needs to know how to view problems from a systems perspective. People need to become data-driven in their thinking. They need to visualize the organization from multiple frames of reference. People need to continually challenge the status quo and adjust business processes based on customer expectations, not internal assumptions or traditions. By spreading the power of systems thinking, leaders can instill deeper levels of trust, innovation, and performance. When you use systems thinking, you start to see the invisible forces that act on our organization. Small signals become more important. Symptoms become relegated to the background as you identify underlying causes. You see patterns of recurring behavior reinforced by either positive learning loops or negative ignorance loops. You come to understand the importance of constantly challenging assumptions, and you appreciate that one can neither be too hasty nor too slow. Timing is everything. Systems thinking teaches us that we can only see change and trends across appropriate timescales. Sometimes we underestimate the pace of change, other times we overestimate it. As one senior manager put it, a leader must be able to see the strategic importance of a particular trend, highlight it, and then instigate a response with the appropriate level of urgency. For example, when Intel's orders declined in the early 2000s, the entire computer industry went through a spasm of contraction, under the assumption that as Intel goes, so goes all the rest of the industry. But this contraction resulted from an oversimplified understanding of the complex supply chain relationships within the industry. That assumption caused many chip manufacturers to be late responding to the boom that began in 2003. Similarly, during the recession of 2008-2009, many people assumed that all industries would be affected. This assumption drove down share values of virtually every company in every sector. But, in fact, the downturn didn't affect certain industries like technology and healthcare, nearly as much as it affected others like housing and the auto industry. And some industries that experts wrote off as comatose, such as banking, made surprisingly quick recoveries. Systems thinking enables people to ask the tough questions, understand the trends behind the trends, and avoid groupthink. And when you use systems thinking, you discover patterns of assumptions that may have been invisible. We refer to these as frames. In the field of cognitive science, it's well understood that frames influence how people think about a particular issue or problem. In the world of politics, there's a conservative frame, which has, for example, the philosophy of we need to be more self-reliant, and a progressive frame, which has the philosophy of we need to do more to help others. In the business world, there are many frames as well, depending upon where you're sitting in the view before you. There's the organized labor frame. Management will take advantage of us, is that philosophy. Or the environmental frame, which is business leaders care more about profits than protecting the environment. Each frame has its own way of seeing the world and responding to problems that arise. But each frame typically oversimplifies the problem and inhibits system thinking or good solutions to tough problems. From an organizational perspective, I've identified 5 frames that affect how a leader sees his or her world, each carrying with it a set of assumptions about what is important. These frames are strategic, governance, performance, process, and leadership. And in the book, I take an in-depth look at each of these 5 business frames. Another example of systems thinking comes from the well-known story of the Titanic, when it set sail from England. The engineers who designed the watertight bulkheads assumed that the hull would never be breached across multiple compartments below the waterline. This led to the popular illusion that the Titanic was unsinkable. And thus, for its maiden voyage, the ship carried only enough lifeboats to handle a small emergency evacuation. In addition, weather reports at the time indicated that the weather was better to the north and that there was no danger from icebergs. So the captain sailed a more northerly course to avoid inclement weather to the south. The owners, of course, wanted the ship to make the crossing in record time, which motivated the captain to sail at high speed through what turned out to be an iceberg-riddled ocean. The story of the Titanic illustrates 2 types of errors, both precipitated by ignorance loops. The first is what I call feedback delays. The weather report upon which the captain relied was based on anecdotal evidence from ships that had sailed 3 weeks earlier. The second is the assumptions of causality. The assumption of causality means that there's an assumption that watertight doors cause the boat to be unsinkable. But in reality, the watertight doors could not handle certain scenarios, including a gash in the bow that caused a waiter to invade several compartments simultaneously. Now, if you think about it, in your own organization, feedback delays are all too common. It would be absurd to drive a car down a street and respond to a red light 15 minutes after it occurred. Yet companies rely on 2-year-old market research to determine whether their product or service is well positioned to meet consumer demand. Watching leaders and managers in action, I've observed there are 3 major challenges to maintaining a systems perspective. First, because we live in an era of accelerating change, it's easy to become distracted by the daily influx of events and issues. To spend 24 hours a day fighting fires, as the vice president of one company told me. Almost by nature, people tend to focus on the things right in front of them, on the people who aren't performing, on the budgets that aren't met, or the logistical issues that need attention. It's easy to become bogged down in the things that are urgent rather than the things that are important, and forget to use systems thinking to create the better solution. Second, people don't get training in systems thinking. Few companies offer it. Few HR managers recognize its value. So it simply isn't a priority to help people develop the critical thinking skills needed to solve tough problems. As a result, there's no forum or no conversation for leaders and managers to engage in a deeper systems think together. And lacking a dialogue like that, it's easy to miss the underlying trends, the bigger opportunities, and the bigger benefits. Third, aside from getting distracted by day-to-day details and the lack of training in systems thinking, it's simply human nature to avoid confronting deeply rooted problems. There are some issues I just as soon leave alone, one manager told me. We've got to pick our battles. Well, that may be human nature at one level. But as a leader, your attention has to be focused in a systems thinking kind of way. Failing to listen to data, to challenge assumptions, or to use systems thinking to address underlying issues, that ultimately imperils the organization. One need look no further than General Motors or Lehman Brothers or Enron. In contrast, think about Porsche, which has single-mindedly focused on engineering high-quality cars for 5 decades. Porsche has consistently been one of the most profitable automobile companies in the world. And not surprisingly, managers at Porsche put a premium on core values, on disciplined performance, and on analyzing their customers and their competitors from a systems perspective. It's this kind of thinking that builds high-performing organizations in a time of accelerating change. In this chapter, I've described how systems thinking helps people address hidden issues. When leaders use different frames to identify problems, when they understand traps like the assumption of causality or feedback delays or the substitution fallacy, they can steer clear of problems and focus their attention where it can have the greatest impact. Leaders who understand their own mental maps and the system of forces acting on the organization are better able to tackle problems at their core. And by defining the problems accurately, they minimize wasted effort, create leveraged solutions that result in continuous improvement and build high-performing organizations.